So we're talking with Dr. Crystal Abidin, who's an expert in the digital influencer space, as a way to try and work through how some users are using and expanding in these sorts of social media environments for all sorts of purposes. Hi, Crystal. How are you going?
Hey, nice to meet you again. Thanks for having me.
So, could you just give us a little bit of a background into your research and the sorts of environments in which you've been working in the past few years?
Right. So I broadly study internet culture and how young people use digital media. But more specifically, I'm looking at how young people use social media to cultivate self branding, a celebrity, or talk about vulnerability. Now, there are many ways to do this. A lot of people in media and communications may go through archives and look through data to do that. But as an anthropologist, we practice this method called in depth participant observation. So, what this means is that apart from just looking at what people do on the internet, I physically go and meet them in person, spend prolonged periods of times with them to find out what they do on the internet, behind the scenes, and everything in between. So, that's what I've been doing for the last 6 or 7 years.
So when you say you spend a long time with them, so you're physically located with them in an environment, and then you're also in the online space with them as well. Is that right?
Yeah. So, for instance, in the online space, it could be something like being an active member of a community or a forum. And these days, it could also mean exclusive friending or communication on social media. But in companionship to that, there are a few actors that I've spent time with. So, looking at influencers per se, I've spent time as a personal assistant, helped to manage their personal diaries, also been a consultant and a strategist for them in the long run. But then there are also the intermediaries, like the social media managers, the agencies. And with these angles, I've embedded in a couple of these agencies to find out what goes on behind the scenes.
So what would be your probably your first top level comment on this environment around the influencers? Like who's involved, what kind of happens in these spaces, and what's the sorts of audiences that are involved in that kind of communication paradigm?
Yep. I think in the very early stages, the primary people who were involved were youth who were broadcasting live. Many a times this could be a solo endeavor, but in their earliest days, if they ever needed help with the recording, it would be a partner, a boyfriend, a girlfriend, a sibling, a parent. So it was very DIY in that aspect, confined in, say, a bedroom. But as these instances grow, influencers help out each other. They sign up to agencies who provide spaces. Some of them become mega influencers who are no longer signed to agencies because they're strong enough to be a household name. So we see here literally an evolution moving from bedroom to a boardroom where they run entire companies running digital estates for multiple people. In terms of audiencing, this also varies. In the earliest days in the 90s, it was literally anyone who's curious to go online. But these days, apart from regular viewers who want to make purchases, you also have influencers tightly watching each other to see who's spearheading trends in the industry, who to follow, who we want to knock out of the scene. Also, clients, they pay a very, very close look at influencers' collateral, not just what they're putting out, but also what people are saying about them, the overall vibe about their values, and also the backlog of their history. Since, as we know, things that get posted on the internet tend to stay there for a very, very long time.
Maybe just to step back one fragment before we go any further, can you define what an influencer is?
Right. An influencer is a vocational micro celebrity, someone who does micro celebrity full time as a career. And a micro celebrity, in turn, back in the 90s, was someone who was famous on the internet. At that point of time, micro celebrities were set up against, say, mainstream Hollywood celebrities. So the big differences were that they had a smaller audience, they did self broadcasting, they only spoke to niche topics. But today, influencers are growing so large, they themselves form their own media. So I think today it makes sense to speak of influencers as anybody who broadcasts on social media vocationally and for profit. And this is important to distinguish between these people and, say, mainstream celebrities who so happen to also be very popular on social media.
Right. Okay. So then, in that environment where you've got influencers and then digital agencies sort of coming together, what's a kind of strategy, or how might influencers operate in this space? Sort of talking to some of the case studies that you might have experienced in your research. Could you describe
Yeah.
some of those?
Yeah, there are various extensive relationships between influencers and agencies. So again, in the very earliest days, people were starting out DIY, and when agencies started forming, they existed primarily to broker deals between influencers and clients. It protected both parties. So clients would get quality content and influencers would get quality payment for their work. So both parties were saved. But as the industry grew, a lot of people were aspirational influencers. They may not have had that organic following or even known how to produce content. So then agencies started grooming in-house talents, holding workshops and competitions to sift through potential personalities. But then again, there's this issue here when influencers grow too big for an agency. Many of them eventually started to move away from agencies to be their own firm altogether, say cultivating super fans into becoming their own micro influencers or helping to manage the back end digital media processes of other companies. So I guess today, from that evolution of the last 10 or 15 years, influencers themselves can also be very strong digital media agencies under their brand name, but working with a whole team under them.
It's really interesting. There was a term you used before, from the bedroom to the boardroom. So the scale of this sort of industry or social media activity is that large, yeah?
Yep, so for instance, not only are influencers now being members of boardrooms of their own firms, many of them are also becoming advisory board members in the largest corporations in the world. Now, as you can imagine, unlike a lot of the broadcasting they do live, a lot of this behind the scenes work may be sensitive data, so it's not always shared as prolifically. But you shouldn't be surprised to know that any mainstream influencer could be working with an agency to help build up their corporate digital media or even up to the government's corporate digital media.
Yep. Okay. So one of the things in some of the research I've just done recently, a lot of the digital agencies were talking about, the influencers they know their audience better than the agencies will. And so in that kind of regard, they sort of let them have free reign on the content that they produce and whatnot. Is that true in from what you've seen?
I think it's true for two types of influencers, those who still remain in the niche and who've never really gone out to be mainstream, because there's this nice shared community that what we know is still safeguarded as secrets or community. So we may have our own slang, our own code words, or our own little bits of understanding. And that back and forth reciprocity is very important. But for the larger mainstream influencers, this kind of subcultural space comes in not at the level of scale, but at the level of longevity. For instance, and if I've got a running joke or a running saying from when I was not as famous today, and I say it and people reciprocate, this is a status symbol or marker that demarcates you as, say, the first early generations of fans, as opposed to, say, everyone who's mainstream and hopping on a bandwagon today. So I guess influencers use different types of ways in order to capture both a large audience, but also to make a smaller pool feel like super fans who are extra special to you. Because these super fans then go on to be so called evangelists for your brand by spreading or retweeting your information or bringing in new people into your domain.
So would it be fair to say then that there's tiers with it? So the influencer kind of sits at the top in some regards, and cultivates, micro influencers of sorts below them, to then larger audiences below them. And so would that I guess suggest, or would that answer how, how influencers kind of sit at the top and people communicate up to them, and often the communication doesn't trickle back down, probably because of the sheer amount of communication that's going on. So is that kind of the environment in which they operate? It's kind of a tiered sort of thing?
That is what it looks like today, now that the industry has gone so large. But it's also the risk and the adversity that a lot of influencers are trying to move away from. Because if we remember, influencers today are supposed to be ordinary people. And therefore, whatever they put out there with very democratic forms of technology is supposed to symbolize that if I can do it, anybody else can do it. This bleeds down from content production all the way to the products they market. For instance, if I can purchase a Chanel bag, it could be that this brand is being watered down and being appealed to the masses. If I can go through a health regime, it could be that this specific brand of tea is really efficient for the masses. So they mustn't lose this quality of being relatable and ordinary. As a result of this, it's very important of them to be reciprocal with their audiences. And it's true, those with very large audiences today may not be able to be reciprocal with every single member, but they still showcase this by being actively responsive to a core group of people whose retweets or responses or regrams will be very visible, thus giving the illusion that these influencers are actually engaging with a larger population than they really are.
Yeah, right. Okay. So on that, that's an interesting point right there, and it sort of steers me into that area of authenticity. So is it fair to say that influencers have to stay on brand, or they're always kind of talking about something which is it's relevant to their audience, and if they then put something which is slightly odd into that mix, then it becomes unauthentic? What's your thoughts on authenticity and influencers?
Yeah, I think the model you've just described is more applicable to mainstream celebrity. If I'm a Hollywood actress, people would assume that the watches, the clothes, the cars that I use are coherent with the brands of which I'm ambassador. Of course, that's also applied to influencers on some level, but the chase for authenticity here is not so much on brand coherence, but also on disclosure and slip ups and revelations to the backstage. So, to do this, influencers sometimes occasionally schedule or stage private moments of publicness. For example, it could be an emotional breakdown, it could be a confession of a very painful event in their lives. But on a more aesthetic side, it could be that in companion to their very professional vlogs and posts, they may at times show you the goof ups, the bloopers, what goes on behind the scenes. They may curate multiple social media accounts for the cleanest, most on brand Instagram versus the real Instagram versus the real Instagram. But if you think about it, all this is really just to foster an impression of authenticity with audiences. It's not to say that one is any more staged than the other, but the effect is there. If you tell audiences that there is a front stage, the desire is for them to want to consume the private lives of influencers. With celebrities, the slip ups come up in gossip magazines and we want to chase after the private. With influencers, the private is staged, packaged, and put online for viewers to look at because it's the main content that's being driven in all their sites.
So it sort of brings me to the point around what's termed collabs, I guess. So if can you talk through some of the, what a collaboration, I guess. Could you talk through what a collab is and what the purpose of, one influencer teaming up with another influencer might be, and why they sort of use that as a strategy?
Yep. On the level of numbers, because that's the baseline in everything in the industry, having a collaboration means ultimately sharing your viewership. It could be that if you've got two influencers who've got similar but not really overlapping audiences, having a collaboration would expose each viewership to the domain and content of each influencer. So there'll be a crossover flow in audienceship, and on the overall, these numbers will rise. Some of the collaborations are client requests and whether or not something is on brand. For example, if I'm a lifestyle fashion influencer and a client wants me to be on brand for a medical course, but I've never really had this topic in my history or my estates, what I could do is to team up with, say, a health blogger or a fitness blogger, and we could brand it into something different: chic, healthy lifestyle, healthy living, healthy fashion even. And so these collisions provide for more creative opportunities for clients to allow us to brand various types of products outside the box. But there are also very different subversive ways that influencers can collaborate to share viewership. I know there's a lot of blog wars, there are a lot of fights happening, there are a lot of cat fights and spats. More often than not, I'm not saying always, but frequently, some of these are actually pre-agreed incidents where influencers say, it's been quiet for a while, top influencers are in the top tier, the bottom ones are in the bottom tier. Maybe we should ruffle a bit of feathers, create a spat, create a controversy, so people will start to check out all these other influencers. And these orchestrated wars are also a very subversive form of collaboration, where you use controversy instead of a product to share your viewership.
And do you think audiences are savvy enough? Are they switched onto this, or is it still very almost covert in how these things take place?
I think it depends. If you are a loose follower or someone who's not very up to date or enthusiastic with the scene, it's very easy to take these things at surface value because these are genuine raw emotions being exchanged. And influencers are also very aware that these things may backfire. So they're putting their reputations at stake here, banging on the fact that all these things will pass and the internet will forget based on the volume and the speed of content passing through. But again, there are also these super fans who've started anti-fan blogs, hate blogs, or dedicated forums attempting to expose influencers for such orchestrations. Many of these things don't really make the news, they don't make mainstream headlines, but they are really thriving economy or an underbelly on the internet where fans go downright to cross-referencing Instagram posts and dates or cross-referencing keywords or spotting these influencers in the street and trying to cross-reference that with the content they put online. So there's a very active anti-influencer community also calling these influencers out on their aesthetics every now and then.
Right. So that's fascinating. So the anti-influencer model, do they use similar strategies to the influencers to sort of to try and combat what they're doing?
Some of these spearheaded people are small-time influencers themselves, and unlike influencers who sell their personal lives or their lifestyles, they bang on producing commentary on controversies and scandals on YouTube, for example, and you can find them all over the place. But for the most part, it is a very collaborative network drawn by many fans across the world. And many of these fans do not do this for fame. What they claim to do this for is for catharsis, whether it's to air their grievances, whether it's to convince people no longer to trust influencers, or whether or not this is just part of the industry that you're involved in sneaking out and smelling out what's true and what isn't. That in itself has also become its own play.
That's really interesting. So the cohort of students that will be watching these videos are in that frame of mind of thinking, well, how can I design a social media strategy? How might I incorporate influencers? How might I even become an influencer myself? So what are the sorts of, I don't know, the tips? What's Crystal's tips on how to become an influencer?
Right. I'm not sure I'm the best expert to say this, having been in the scene for a very long time. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of labor involved in curating a good feed. The standard feed is for someone to be pristine, and it varies across different ecologies. So if you're on Instagram, for example, it's very commodity and luxury oriented. It's not so much on your selfies, but what makeup brands you're wearing or what clothes can be featured in your selfies. If you're going on something like Twitter, for example, then it's wit and brevity in the use of words. If you're something on YouTube, it's about your audience engagement, but also how well you can splice videos. So just based on the platform itself, if you've selected one, try and understand what the most successful people on those platforms are doing and model after that. Because it could be that what works on one platform doesn't carry over to the other. Now, when you've chosen your platform, I would then ask if you would like to be focusing on a particular genre. So let's say we focus on YouTube. Unboxing videos are very different whether you're a child, whether you're a tech person unboxing tech goods, or whether you're a blogger or fashion model unboxing makeup or fashion apparel. So each of these genres also have their own staple symbolism. They also have their own staple keywords that you use to draw audiences in, and you want to familiarize yourself with that vocabulary. Once you've done those two things, looking at the specific genre on a specific platform, I would advise you to look at who you enjoy on these platforms. They may not always be the biggest, most prolific influencers in the scene. It could be someone just starting out, someone who's really alternative, or someone who's small and niche, but you enjoy the way in which they can relate to a small audience. If it's someone you want to emulate, go ahead and try to practice. But also remember that the key thing about being an influencer is that if you can be replicable, if you can be copy and pasted, or if you're too common a lot, you lose your originality and you use your value to clients. Because ultimately, what they want is to be able to say, I want that person, I remember them by this one tagline. And if there are 500 of you who fit into that exact same description, your overall market value tends to be watered down.
So it's kind of it's shaky ground, yeah, because if you hit the sweet spot, you can really fly, but if you don't quite get that sweet spot, then you just you're into the pile with all the other influences.
Yeah, which is why there are many super influencers who are the leaders of their pack. There are others who are still aspirationally trying to be leaders of their pack, but there's also a good lot of micro influencers in between who are just very happy, waiting for a new trend to be debuted and then following after that, whether it's to perform a similar aesthetic or to follow after an influencer so closely that her fans or his fans also trickle down to you as sort of like an imitation or a second class representation of the original.
So, just my final question here, Crystal, is around. It seems a little bit exclusionary in that it's very, if you're on Instagram, you're looking at luxury goods. If you're on YouTube, you're a video editor, etc., etc. Some of those conventions are very clearly stated, and in some regards, I think you could argue that that's targeting a very specific group of users, which would other a whole lot of other people. Is it fair to say that it's a little bit exclusionary? Is the whole influencer environment?
I think today the influencer industry is so diverse that there's basically anyone for any product or service you want to market. We've got people who are doing parody influencing, meaning they come across as haters and they hate everything that influencers do. But in actual fact, they're still performing the same sort of self branding and self publicity to bring awareness to a product or a service that they are dissing. This is also a risk for some companies, but they also understand that controversy sometimes travels further than effect and brand love. So there are also many different ways in which clients are now adjusting to influencers who first, most importantly, know how to capture eyeballs, secondly, know how to communicate your message, and thirdly, know how to transfer their viewership to your brand or your product. Whether or not this comes out through affect and love for a brand or through controversy and hate, it's beginning to matter less and less to advertisers who are aware that the industry is just becoming so saturated at the moment.
So, Crystal, thanks so much for talking with us today. Some really unique insights into the influencer space, and of course, if you've got more questions or you really want to follow Crystal's work a whole lot more closely, it's at Wishcries pretty much across every platform, isn't it?
Wish Chris for Crystal.
All right. Well, thanks very much for talking with us today, and we'll see you on the internet. Yeah.
Yeah, see you there.